What's up, everybody? Welcome again to the Chasing Creativity podcast. This is episode 25 with academic researcher Matthew Slayton. Episode 25. All right, let's jump right into this thing. First, I want to say thank you to everyone out there listening. We're at episode 25. It's a little benchmark right there, a quarter of the way to episode 100. So thank you to you out there listening, and thank you to every guest who has come on so far, taking time out of their day to come on a given podcast episode. Now, jumping into today's episode. To start things off, the song you just heard is from an electronic music producer known by the name of Cube, C-U-B-E, and the song is titled Identity. If you'd like to hear more, you can find his music on SoundCloud at soundcloud.com/RICHIE-BOULLOSA, on Twitter at cube__music, that's CUBE__music. Instagram, you can be found at cube__music, or at facebook.com at /cube EDM. Now, go check him out. Show your support. He makes amazing music, so make sure to go check out his music. And as I mentioned, show your support. Now, jumping in a little bit further here with what we had just heard out, if you would like to have your music shown out at the beginning of a podcast episode, simply reach out to me. You can reach out to me on Instagram at chasing.creativity.podcast or at chasingcreativitypodcast@gmail.com if you'd like to reach out via email. We can chat about your music, and if you just want to chat about other stuff, music, podcasts, whatever, I would love to do so. I'm always so down to talk with fans, or people who are enjoying the podcast or whatever. So make sure to do that. If you would like your music shown out, just go ahead and give me a shout. Now, other things to mention here before moving forward. There is a Patreon for the podcast. This is fairly new. I think I've been mentioning it for the last couple episodes now. There are some benefits out there. So for Patreons, what that means is you can support the podcast for as little as like $5 a month, and you get perks. So you get t-shirts, stickers, shout outs at the end of podcast episodes, all sorts of cool stuff. So if you're interested, go check it out. It's patreon.com/chasingcreativity. I believe it's just Chasing Creativity, not Chasing Creativity Podcast, but you can find it. Search Patreon, you'll find the podcast episodes. So on to other news. There is merch. So I've been trying to do this for some time, got around to doing it. There are t-shirts up on the little website now. Website's just pretty much a landing page, but there is a merch section. So if you do want a t-shirt, it supports the podcast and you get to wear Chasing Creativity Podcast t-shirt. So go check it out, chasingcreativitypodcast.com. Check out the merch. Now, talking about really important stuff, today's guest. So today's guest is Matthew Slayton. He is an academic researcher who early on in his academic career studied the philosophy of science and music composition. In postgraduate work, his focus transitioned more onto what we'll cover in today's conversation, but he's focusing more on the evolution of music. So, or evolution of music cognition, excuse me. Now, this is a fascinating topic. It's something that I was not well versed in before our conversation. I'm still really not. I'm going to really leave it up to him to really explain exactly what he studies in the research that he's doing. But from how I understand it, this allows him to ask fundamental questions about how music can really mean anything to us as humans at all. Now, he looked to better understand this question and address this question by looking at how humans potentially evolved with music. So the evolution of music cognition. So it's really fascinating stuff. We get into it and it was a fascinating conversation. So I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to start butchering his research. I will let him dig into it, and hopefully the questions I ask are poignant and useful as I kind of jump around and pretend I know things that I really don't. So that's it. I hope you enjoy the podcast episode. If you would like to learn more about him, you can find him on Twitter at Slayton Composer. That's SlaytonComposer. You can find more on that Twitter, as I mentioned, or on his website at MatthewSlayton.com/media. So that's it. We're going to jump right into today's episode. I really hope you enjoyed this one. I mean, I had a great time speaking with him. I thought this was a fascinating topic. So that's it. More episodes to come weekly. I will look to push these out on Wednesday, not hold out until Fridays. And that's it. I hope to speak with you all again soon. Matthew Slayton, how is it going?
It's going well.
Awesome. Thank you for joining. I am really excited about this one. Just to give a little background, starting this episode out, you and I have been speaking over Twitter, excuse me. We've been speaking over Twitter, and we started speaking after that via email, and you were sharing some of your research, some papers that you have presented at recent conferences, and it was, to start, fascinating. And in an area of research that I've never really looked into on my own, so today for myself, and I think for all the listeners, it's going to be really interesting. But why don't we start out there? Just give some background as to what exactly you're studying, a little bit of your background educationally.
Sure. So I'm a composer and a researcher. In undergrad, I did a kind of it was like a self-designed major in theoretical cognitive science. I went initially to grad school at U Chicago to do a PhD in philosophy of science. I focused on evolutionary theory and biology and a couple other things. I'd been composing the whole time, on the side, as so many of us do. Right. And I mastered out of that program to go to San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Mm-hmm. There, I did my master's in music composition, and I also did independent work in music cognition. And at the moment, I'm retraining in neuroscience to do more research in that area. And I know you've had a bunch of different researchers on the podcast in the past. So what I'm here to talk about mainly, though, is this area of work that I kind of, it's like that odd thing you get into when you're in school. But it's an area of research that doesn't really fall into a discipline. But I mean, it sounds like you found it interesting. I think it's amazing. And so I have a sort of ongoing theoretical project that looks at the evolution of meaning, and in particular, in this case, the evolution of music cognition and musical meaning.
Now, so one thing that I had gotten from your research is, as you kind of made this transition, you presented a paper, and this is a lot of the material you had passed over, was the paper that you presented at the Biosemiotics conference at UC Berkeley. Okay, So to start, for myself and for the listeners out there, what exactly is biosemiotics, and what was that conference really looking to better understand? Sure.
First, as a kind of disclaimer, you should definitely interrupt if it's going too long. No. Do my best.
I want you to go deep. Absolutely. No.
So semiotics is the study of signs. It kind of has its birth in linguistics, in the end of the 19th century. Semiotics proper really gets applied to interpreting literature and those sorts of things today. Biosemiotics is maybe a subset or an offshoot that has its roots in a kind of biology that didn't make it to today, and I'll explain what that. I know that sounds a little abstract and ominous, but I'll explain. So the sort of fundamental tenet of biosemiotics is that life processes, so the cognitive and behavioral ones that we're familiar with, down to biochemistry and all that, are made up of sign processes. so that they're about something. It's like, and this stands in contrast to what you could call like a reductionist standard biology, where, you know, like meaning and aboutness and intention and all these things, aren't there. And, you know, the sort of usual argument is, you know, humans are just made of atoms and meat. And then the other side is, oh, but humans have a soul. That's not material. It's something more.
Right.
And then biosemioticians are trying to find a kind of third way through.
Oh, that's so fascinating. So when you say a third way through, right, not just meat, not just soul, this biosemioticians what exactly is meant by signs? I don't quite fully grasp that. Is it?
So,
yeah, maybe jump.
So that is such a great follow-up question, because what signs are is something that biosemioticians debate all the time. I think it might be helpful if I kind of back my way into the answer to your question.
Okay.
So in Saussurean linguistics, there's this difference made between the object and sign. So you have an actual tree and the word tree that refers to the plant. And then most biosemioticians love Peirce, who is a philosopher and added a third part to the sign, what he called the interpretant. So basically, there's the object, the sign, and the part of the sign that occurs in your head as you interpret that sign.
Yeah.
So, what a sign is, it has to do with the relationship between your environment and you, but not just the environment that's out there, but the environment that you perceive, that we have an active role in constructing the environment that we see. So a sign is, anything at all. It could be, like a stop sign is red, which is bright, and you associate with, this demands our attention, to a word, or, and anything in between. It's an association or a connection where something refers to something else.
Okay. And part of that has to do with as you mentioned, your interpretation, right? So if what I understand as a stop sign in my mind is different than what you understand as a stop sign in your mind, that's where this kind of all plays. That interpretation that's kind of personal to oneself. Is that kind of getting there?
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay.
And even more so that, there's a kind of argument that, signs are, generally pretty arbitrary. The word tree doesn't have anything to do with wood or height or anything, but you could argue that signs are not arbitrary because there's a specific finite life history to the use of each sign that, however long language has existed or humans have existed, a sign, which could be a word or, something in music or any system. We could in principle trace the history of the use of that sign, throughout the ages to see how the meaning has shifted. So it's not arbitrarily connected. It has its own kind of natural history.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you found yourself where the way you wanted to maybe better understand musical meaning fit really well with biosemiotics. Like there was a way that you could kind of find a good way to utilize that basis of understanding and research to move forward the understanding of musical meaning. Is that right?
Yes and no. Well, sorry, I guess kind of doubly yes, but I'll explain because, we can talk about, how the cell works and all kinds of, nuts and bolts of biology in a biosemiotic framework. But the way that theorists tend to talk about like the, human matters is using language as a kind of default.
Right.
We talk about words and how they refer to objects in the world, and music tends to get less play. I think, music is is non-referential or maybe self-referential, or something that I talk about. And it's harder to talk about. And that's where I thought that's where I was trying to make my intervention. To take music, which we all agree is great. And to use it to challenge these ideas of how, how symbolic behavior works. And in particular for me, how it's possible that music has any meaning at all. In particular, in a kind of evolutionary sense.
Right. Yeah. So there was a couple points that I'd pulled out from your paper where the way that different theorists have addressed music, evolutionary, you really didn't like. There's a couple that you threw out that like really upset you. So maybe give some background as to like what it was, how people are looking to address that first, like what that really means as what that is, and then how you're looking to look at it a bit different.
Sure. Well, let me maybe ask you. So like if someone asked you what music was for, right, what would you say?
It's a challenging question because it's very interesting because of course it excites emotion, right? If you listen to music, I think at a surface level, immediately someone can say it excites emotion, and for that reason, people write music to convey emotion. But I think it's really interesting because there's cultural references to that too. Like I've watched some documentaries where different melodic scales will mean different things to different cultures. Like one melody can mean happy to one culture, but then that same scale can mean sad or solemn to a different culture. So it's almost that it can excite emotion, but it's based in your experiences thus far and your cultural experiences, all these different things. So I think that's what interested me so much about this podcast and these types of questions, because I think so easily a person can say, oh, it just excites emotion, but I know there's so much more to that. So that's kind of why I do these and I don't know. I kind of...
That's great. So, I mean, maybe some of these, psychologists and archaeologists should ask musicians this question more often, because I thought your answer was great.
Cool. Thank you.
It has emotion and communicates emotion. It's for communication and expression, and it's different depending on the audience and the culture that produces it.
Right.
I think that's a pretty good answer, actually.
Cool. Awesome.
Just to contrast that, that subtle and insightful answer, there are less good answers out there. So the one, I mean, I kind of jump up and down on Steven Pinker's auditory cheesecake idea. It's probably out of context at this point. I actually like his books, but at the very least, in 97, I guess, he made this claim that, in the same way that cheesecake tastes good, but it's not, healthy, like your body doesn't require cheesecake. That, you have a brain that's good at pattern recognition and memory and whatever else, and music kind of piggybacks on what you might call like actual adaptations that you need for survival. But it's not important in its own right. Like the example I gave in the paper was, at some point our ancestors were small enough to be eaten by a predatory bird. So maybe we have a good ear for, a certain frequency range. And that's why we have a taste or a good ear for, the melodic contour. Right. But, it's not like we evolved to hear melodies. We just evolved not to be eaten. So, and like I suggested, there's plenty of ways you can disagree with that account. An important one, there's a ton of them, but I kind of want to isolate one, is that, in the way that our culture does music, there's experts and non-experts. And of course, in other cultures or even daily life that we don't really pay as much attention to, most people have a capacity for music in some way. So you say music has it has some sort of function in the past. It bonds people together. You sing to babies, you sing while you work, that sort of thing. So the two sides here, and just, the two sides are music has no adaptation. It's this like mental virus. Or music has various adaptations that we imagine would be relevant in the past.
I see. Okay.
what my argument is that these are both wrong. And this gets into a debate which is about structuralism versus adaptationism, where, and I think the fastest way I can get through all that is to say that, we have this we have this, we imagine what it was like to live in the past,
right?
But we don't know.
Right.
So you imagine whatever, hunters and loincloths and the whole thing, but, there's no, that's not based on, evidence. We're just assuming that we know what it was like.
Right.
So that's one problem with thinking about adaptations. The other is that you assume that now we have fully formed music and language. And at some point in the past, we had broken language and in music, cave people grunted and didn't conjugate verbs or anything, and their music was primitive as well.
Right.
But an argument that Gregory Bateson made and people make now is that language and music and all these things were never broken. Mm-hmm. They were specific to their time, and for those people, they were most likely. To them, it meant whatever it meant in the same way that for us, it means whatever it means.
Oh, yeah. Okay. That I get. Yeah. I understand that. That's interesting, right? So it was framed in the context of that time, in the frame of that culture. That's what brought it the meaning. And we're kind of in this slice of existence, and then fast forward 2,000 years, music and language could be totally different, and they're looking back, potentially, right? They're looking back at us, and it's just that frame of time where this is when the music that we had, and this is when the language that we had conveyed the different either signs or indicators to other people as for meaning, if that makes a bit of sense.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Because the problem is, are we talking about the actual conditions at the time, or are we telling a story that arrives with us today? And so instead of, I don't know if you had a chance to look at, I cited, there is a musicologist named Gary Tomlinson who recently wrote two books on evolutionary musicology, and I can't recommend them highly enough.
Okay.
But he makes this argument that we should be trying to explain, language, music, meaning, whatever, in a forward-looking way that takes the conditions at the time, not in a back-looking way that has us arrive at the contemporary version. And I can say more about that, but it seemed kind of where we were headed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's fascinating. I'm down to dig into it.
So there's an example he uses about Cheney and Seafarth's work. So they're really famous for observing baboons. And there's a bunch of important observations and interpretations there, but the one relevant for our discussion is what they call the syntax of social knowledge. So evidently, baboons will make some kind of vocalization or call when they meet another, so you see another baboon, it indicates something about their positionality, like the sort of hierarchical relationship. So I don't know, this baboon is higher or lower or something like that. So we might say, oh, look at that. They're communicating, these meaningful utterances to each other. But what they said is that, that these words, if you want to call them, they do have a social function, that there is a syntax to the way they interact, but they don't necessarily have any semantic content.
Interesting. Okay.
So these calls indicate the hierarchy in like a functional, structural way. But they don't mean anything or refer to anything in the way that words do. Right. Which is, first of all, which I think is amazing. Yeah. But Tomlinson connects this all up and says that, we think of music as having a certain, as being something we do, just like you said, to express emotion and connect and all that. But it's very possible that it arose out of social interactions, and who knows for what purpose.
Okay.
It may be the same as today, it may not be. Maybe music and language were more similar and overlap, maybe they didn't. But the point is that the one thing we do know that early humans had is a society.
Right.
So let's take the way that a society functions and look forward to say how meaningful symbolic systems could arise, but don't say anything else.
Wow. So okay. Right.
Maybe we should back up.
Yeah. No. So this is all fascinating, right? Because like when we were touching on the piece with the baboons, that where you mentioned that it has hierarchical importance, but there's no semantic value to it. That makes total sense. And if I were to just, a lot of this for me personally is just, rewinding thousands and thousands of years and thinking of what that would even seem like, right? And I'm just speaking about humans at that point, what it would seem like to start forming early language and early music. But it seems to at least when the argument is framed that way, it seems to make sense that if there were early ties to language kind of emerging with music, and that there were these different timbres and different auditory excitements that early humans would make that distinguish different ideas but didn't necessarily mean a word, that for me seems plausible of kind of an emergence of the idea of music. Like that
Yes.
that makes sense to me. And
Exactly.
Right.
Well, I mean, sorry, I didn't mean to stop.
No,
What
absolutely.
you're saying is totally true. And so then we say, okay, so we know that people are embedded in some kind of environment, a material environment and a social environment. And our, evolving brains have different cognitive capacities. And so not only do you interact with the environment in some way, and then, maybe there's some kind of symbolic behaviors that arise out of, the interactions you have. But, and this is where you get to this like cognitive niche construction recursion, which is a bunch of, kind of technical words that just mean that you evolve with respect to your environment. That's how evolution works. And that you create your environment not just by perceiving it in the way that your brain works, but now there's a symbolic environment because, early language, whatever kind of symbolic systems there are, you evolve with respect to those that now exist.
Yeah.
So now we're talking about emergence. You're kind of like, off to the races.
Right.
That it's not just for, social function or survival function, but like, that humans will have evolved with respect to the systems that they're creating.
That's so interesting, because then you think of it kind of in a survival of the fittest scenario where if there were certain people at that time who could communicate better, right? There's this emergence of symbols, right? And that kind of almost begins for this layer of communication. That might be the more, advantageous traits in characteristics of early humans that could propagate on, and then it's evolving over time. So that's so fascinating, right? Because right when you mentioned like those are going to be the people that evolve now with those traits, right? They can move forward. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting.
So, I feel like we may have gotten kind of far away from the topic.
Oh, that's okay.
Maybe I should let you ask what you wanted.
Well, so then kind of tying it back to the conference and the research, and by all means, I love going down these paths because I think this is what makes for the most interesting interviews, the most interesting conversations, because again, I think I've said this on other ones, but if it's just question, answer, I mean, that, you don't get to like the real meat of these like really interesting ideas. So anyways, I'm absolutely down to go down as many rabbit holes as possible.
I was going to say,
go ahead. Yeah.
So then, as far as my research then, what I'm interested in is that, we can talk about music and say what we think it is, but music is fundamentally this endless chain of signs about other signs,
Okay.
that occur in communication exchanges and interactions, and that was probably as true, whatever, 100,000 years ago, or however long, as it is today. If you think about it, because what's so interesting is that, music doesn't necessarily refer to anything. It's not referential the way that language is, but, it refers to previous music that you've heard.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And I mean, there's so many interesting ways to think about, like why there's so many, like, so people have asked me, why there appear to be so many genres now. And it seems like we're special. We have the internet, but well, in this case, it's probably just a matter of perspective that at some point, all music will be early 21st century and it'll all sound the same to someone. But, but the point is that, music is built around these associations, and the meaning that music has for us has to do with what we associate the different parts to be, or, how they refer to each other, given, the entire history of, well, not only the history of music, but the history of, of the cognition of music as well.
Yeah. Oh, I love that idea so much, because to me, it then, it gives an understanding, a better understanding for like hit music, right? Because if people listen to a top 40 song, right, it has a certain flavor to it, it has a certain sound, and that's always changing, right? But you'll find these kind of copycat songs of a specific genre, and it's in any genre. But let me just focus and pick on top 40 here for a minute.
Sure.
But right, so there's you'll get a flavor where, okay, it sounds exactly like this previous song, right? And you get from that artist who's producing that song, they want to kind of fit in that genre and maybe have another top 40 song and kind of fit here. But that's so cool that you look at it from that perspective, because it's contextual, right? So if someone liked that previous song and they got certain emotions from that previous song and they have certain associations with that previous song, they're going to get the same kind of associations and ideas with this song that pulls on the different elements of that previous song, and it's going to kind of invoke a lot of those ideas again, right? So
yes.
So it's interesting that way, because you're like some sort of magician that knows how to pull on emotion. You're like
you're right.
Right. These artists can know they're tapping into some previously generated emotions, almost something like that. So that's really, really cool.
No, I mean you're absolutely right. I agree. I mean, and then it just depends like different genres will place premiums on different features, right? That should it be, different enough to be a different song, but it has the right beat and, those sorts of things that we want. Like I think about it a lot in contemporary classical music, or like, avant-garde music, which I guess is a genre that I, write in. And we all worry about the fact that there's no audience, but there are people who just think it's the best, and the people who don't get it, like, oh, we wouldn't want them as fans.
Right.
Anyway.
Oh, that's in every genre. But
yeah, exactly. Right. But the point is that kind of snobbery. Well, that's true in every genre, and in particular, all music from a genre you don't know very well sounds the same until you get into it, and you notice all the differences.
Oh, totally. No, I absolutely agree. I mean, so I'm a big fan of techno. My girlfriend's a huge fan of techno. And from an outsider's perspective, techno can have a lot of reoccurring elements. I mean, there are techno songs where it's literally a 4/4 kick, and then they bring in different elements, right? And then hi-hat comes in. And so, but from an outsider, for someone who doesn't listen to a lot of techno, that right off the bat can be like, okay, this is all the same. It's super easy to produce, but I love the idea that with those minimal amount of elements, that can make it the most challenging to write, because you only have a certain subset of things that you can utilize as tools. If you're trying to stick within a specific genre and be very minimal, it's very limited, and for that reason, I think it can even be more challenging.
Absolutely. It's interesting, this matter of perspective, because it's something I put in one of the papers. And I hate to call him out. Well, I'll just say this, that I saw a talk, at school where, someone like a flute player performs on these like, reproductions of ancient bone flutes. Okay. And, so they performed, and it's this very doleful, elegiac, like slow melody, and everyone's kind of in the room is very quiet and reverent. Some people are crying, and I do not mean to call out anyone who's having any kind of experience, if it's a performance. Yet, what they talked about after in the talk was, that like some features in music are universal, that this instrument is speaking to us across millennia, because there's something that binds all humans together.
Right.
Something like that. And I don't want to be a buzzkill or anything, but that couldn't possibly be true.
Right.
I mean, so like what the issue is that we have this image of like, an early human who's by themselves and doesn't have electricity, and it's just so sad and lonely, and that they feel maybe like the potential of what humanity will be, and they cry out on their, and it's just this mythologizing. Yeah. Like, if we could actually hear their music, it wouldn't sound like anything, probably. And if they could hear our music, it wouldn't sound like anything.
Right.
So like, it's a fun story. And I think old instruments are awesome, but it's just an interesting example. Times change, cultures change. And, there may be universals in terms of like, frequency range, maybe some scales due to, our ears or limitations of instruments. But like, just like in the case of language, it seems that at least what I've kind of come to realize is that musical universals are probably boring and not really worth talking about. Like, they're there, but they're going to be just fundamental nuts and bolts universals that we wouldn't necessarily care to talk about.
So I think I've toyed with this idea on different episodes, and you were like the perfect guy to ask this question and really start digging into this stuff. And the thing I like to play with is, then would you say that there's no like universal pleasing chord structures, right? So if you imagine, or do you think it's like completely cultural? So if you imagine a scale, like, just a major scale, da 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 da, and rather than a minor scale, right, which can have more, I think, culturally some ominous tones, right? So there's definitely a cultural component to major versus minor, happy versus sad. But do you then think that there is no kind of maybe inherent beauty in melody and music that musicians are tying into when they write something interesting and they catch something that a lot of people like? What do you think that is? Or is it something that's just unique enough that people say, oh, this is unique, but it's kind of similar to other things I've listened to, so I think it's awesome? Like, what do you think that is?
Right. I feel like there's so much at stake to that question.
It's a hard question.
Yeah. Well, at first, sort of like pre-answer, it was my understanding that even in the history of like Western classical music, the role of major and minor, or the meaning of major and minor scales is flipped. That major was kind of the like sad, plaintive one, and minor was more sprightly.
Oh, that's cool.
And at some point, someone will have to look this up and confirm if that's true and when the switch happened. I'm pretty sure it's true. I just don't know what the transition was like. But to answer your question, is there something? Is it a melody? Is it something in tonality? Is it a chord progression? Is it a chord? Is there something that kind of just hits everyone in the same way?
Right.
enough that we could say, here it is. We found it.
Right.
We found, musical beauty.
Yeah.
It kind of reminds me of this example. It's like, if we wanted to find life on other planets, we'll send a probe to check and get a sample. But the danger is that there's some bacteria on that probe.
Okay.
So when you land your probe, you infect.
Oh yeah, right.
The place you're trying. So look at that.
Right.
And it turns out that you brought it. I think that's sort of like. I think there's kind of like a colonial critique to all this. That if there's something universal, it's because enough people were told this is great, and for whatever political and economic reasons were forced to believe it's great. So, I mean, that's kind of maybe sucking all the air out of the possibility of true beauty. But, my humble opinion is that even if there were such a thing, it's so mixed up with, social and political and economic factors. Right. I don't know if we could identify it.
That's, yeah. Well, no, I don't mean to cut you off, but while you're kind of going into it, it makes a lot of sense, because if, say, we found that thing, right? Okay, we found like this chord structure, whatever it is, right? People would reproduce it, and then it would be garbage, right? Because part of the interesting elements of music is like that uniqueness, right? It's something unique that catches your ear, and it's like, okay, this is new, and you listen to it for a month, and then you're kind of on to the next thing. So it would be.
That's a really, really smart observation. You're absolutely right. Yeah, because it'd become a ringtone and a commercial jingle. I'm like, I'm so sick of this beautiful thing.
Right. So it wouldn't last. It would be junk. So it would have to be something where it's like beautiful in like some like unique aspect. Like it has to be like this shade. Like, I don't know. So that's why music is so fascinating to me, because like for songs I love, I feel like it's just beautiful, but then it's like, did that person hit on something, right? That there's some underlying beauty that they have uncovered through music, or is it all cultural and it's all preference, and it's just, I don't know. It's so interesting. It's so interesting.
It is. I mean, but like these sort of, the role of these narratives kind of, it hits at all different levels. Like, people I don't think this isn't breaking news or anything, but the idea that I think it was Mozart's wife, maybe, who like destroyed all of his sketches to support the theory that it just came out of his head all at once.
Whoa.
And he wrote sketches just like anyone else.
Right.
He was very good.
Yeah.
But, and like they tell, new musicians to like, you gotta sell it. You can't go up there and like, oh, I'm really sorry, this isn't done. Like, you have to be like, amazing. And it feels ridiculous to say, but for some reason, there's something like an audience wants to trust that they're hearing someone.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And so, from the very top, one of the greatest classical composers, and at the very bottom is me. And at each,
I'm under you,
at each point, you, at each level, you have to sell it. And I think it sounds like we agree that that's not just like an unfortunate reality of the business of music, but it's actually a rather profound and fundamental piece of how aesthetics work, right? Is that you have to be told this movie won an award.
Right.
And oh my God, it's amazing. And it's probably good, but there's no objective way to tell.
Oh, that's so fat, because then it totally ties into popular music, especially for really young kids, I think, who imagine, bringing yourself back to being age 13, 14, when you had a lot of influence by people around you. You wanted to be cool, you wanted to fit in. So if a certain group of kids said, okay, this is the coolest music out right now, I mean, you're going to be so heavily influenced by that perspective that it's gotta have influence,
Yeah. And to me, that goes all the way back. Cause, my like perennial theoretical commitment is that at the bottom of all of this is the social. So, you might think, well, there's great works, there's masterpieces, symphonies and, just great tracks, and that what a 13-year-old listens to fit in is less valid. But my sense, or my, I don't know, hypothesis, let's say, is that, throughout the history of music, right, fitting in, being cool, like all, social capital,
right,
it was always important. Early humans, great humans throughout history, even today, it's not like we stopped being good or suddenly became better. It's like being cool is really important.
Yeah.
And like the sooner we embrace the reality of that, I think the more honest our understanding of how music works will become.
Right. Because that totally ties me into just being young. And I remember there was bands I loved, right? And my dad,
Sure.
he was a singer, opera singer. So, and he taught
Cool.
at the university level as a professor in vocal performance, and he studied at Juilliard. So like he was like an opera singer, right? So he would be on his high horse when I was in like third or fourth grade, and I'd show him Blink-182, and he would try and put on, NPR, classical music, and have his nose, well, here's the thing, even at that age, it's still like he's tied into the same social constructs where he wants to be cool, quote unquote, and and listen to classical music, right, and all these different things, where so he's looking at me and thinking, okay, you're crazy. I'm looking at him and saying, no, this is the good stuff, you're crazy, right? So there's so much perspective there too, because you forget it's like it's almost it's as if it's not just kids that are trying, and you mentioned this too, but it's not just kids that are trying to be cool. Everyone is across the board. Adults are too. They're trying to fit into their little social bubble that they want to have this given image for. And I'm going to do the same thing when I'm 50 or 62. So I'm not I'm not hating, but so it's interesting.
That's a fantastic example. It also sounds like we're pretty close in age because, there was a time. Not that I've listened to Blink-182 in a while, but I was definitely really into it. Does it have to be a guilty pleasure? First of all, they were great, and if nothing else, maybe it's an example of how like studio production is, or like masterful studio production. Who knows? We don't have to decide the merits of but, I don't know, pop punk bands, but I hope I'm strong enough to hear something when I'm older, hate everything about it, and say like, that's cool. Just like lie to myself until I believe it.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard as hell. We're going to hate it so much.
I know all the stuff that's so popular now. It's these SoundCloud rappers.
I guess I already hate
I know.
it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It really has, because you were mentioning we might be around the same age group. I'm about to be 30, so I'm listening to what's popular for like 15, 16 year olds, like SoundCloud rappers, and all these guys with tattooed faces and stuff. And I can't listen to it. And so I'm again on my high horse thinking I know the best music, blah, blah, blah. But it's funny. It's really interesting. And it has to partly be, some of it has to be just age and part of life, right? When you're at that age, you want something that's just totally out there, counterculture, right? You want to piss off your parents, that kind of thing, right? So it's just going to hit on all those things when you're that age. But yeah, man, it's really interesting. Oh, this I thought was pretty interesting. I think you might have a good way to address this. So I think I might have spoken about this in a previous conversation. I think it was with Manuel Anglada Tort, and we had been speaking about halfway through the conversation, the idea that when an artist has a given album, right? So say, there's this artist that you love, and you found that artist when they had a couple albums out already. So you dove into the music, you listened to them a lot, and then they put out a new album and you don't like it. And a lot of people say, oh, they sold out, this new album sucks, blah, blah, blah. And then they switch artists that they like. Well, it might kind of tie into what we're talking about here, because you might like that band based on like cultural influence, right? Or influence from friends and family, all this stuff. Maybe more friends, right? So you think you like these first albums based on the influence of other people. You listen to a lot, so it kind of gets this imprint in your brain, so you know the melodies, so they're catchy. And then when you hear Fresh, the new album, you're like, I don't like this at all. What's happened, right? So it could almost be that same kind of thing happening there, where it's like that cultural influence, or maybe you don't even really like the music to begin with.
Right. Yeah, of course. No, I remember you mentioning that on the podcast before. I remember that conversation. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's a great example of, all the different factors that play into taste. And we'd like to isolate, the different factors and focus in on something. Like the way that musicology talks about musical meaning a lot of times has to do with formal qualities. And, I mean, I don't hate music theory. I think it's kind of trendy to hate it. But, you do like you do some kind of theoretical and formal analysis, and you find where the meaning is. It's probably looking in the wrong spot, but it comes from a similar place from the example you're describing, where like, hey, it's the same band, or it's the same chord progression. I don't know why it works in one case and not in another case. And yeah, just like you said, it's for all the other factors, all the sort of like social factors, the daily mess of life that influences whether you're down or not.
Oh yeah. Yeah, man, that's such a fascinating idea, because like when you start going into music theory, and I never studied music theory at all when I was growing up playing piano and guitar and stuff. I just played songs and stuff, right? So I don't have a background in it, so things I might say right now might sound like a bunch of bullshit, but the idea is that certain chord progressions again can certain notes can fit within a progression, and that would fit within this theoretical scaffolding, right? So like if you're going along this scale and you play one note versus another note, one fits within this scale, one doesn't. And so that almost makes me kind of push back at the idea then, like, why are those scales? Does that make sense? Like if that is that just arbitrarily assigned because we're like, okay, this is this scale, right? And or is there the idea that this scale sounds pleasant to the ear because it follows this progression, and for that reason it has meaning? Does that make sense at all? Just kind of.
Sure. Well, I mean,
yes and no.
Yes, but I mean, do you have a question, or are you asking specifically like how do I think scales?
I guess that's it.
Meaning?
I guess like, is there an actual meaning behind the progression of a scale? And again, I think we're just getting into inherently like, is there some sort of inherent meaning to music? Yeah.
Well, so people talk like there is, like if you're in music school, you'll learn all the modes and say, okay, so this mode starts with a minor second, and that tension so close to the tonic has a particular, function with respect to the tonality. And, it does, but at the same time, like you said, that, or, if you just play a certain chord, and it works the past 9 times, it doesn't mean it's going to work on the 10th time. It kind of, I want to keep switching off topic, but it reminds me of, like when people debate about whether clean comedy is better than, dirty comedy, and people say, like you can't just go on stage and say fuck over and over. It's not going to get a laugh. That, the point is that there's still artistry, even if you're using certain language other people don't. And I think it's similar in this case, that like, like for me, I'll hear, some kind of tonal progression, like in, a piece of classical music or in a pop song, and I'm always sick of it. And then every so often I'm like, oh, that was so, God damn it.
Yeah.
Like where something simple really moves you. And, I'll feel embarrassed after. But so that just kind of complicates the question, because I could say that, these scales and chord progressions are just, historical accidents. It happened at some point for some reason. People copied it. People find variations. But the point is you have this kind of lineage that comes off of whatever, that time in 1100 when this got laid down for the first time. But what maybe, I don't know. I mean, that's the argument I would just make full stop. But since we're kind of talking from the lens of music appreciation as well, or as fans, there does seem to be something.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if it's beyond, or it's just the fact that this music means something to us the way we grew up. And, just because you understand it in an intellectual way doesn't mean it ceases having an effect on you. That's probably what's going on. But, I don't want to take away the associations or meaning of a certain scale or something because I'm calling them, accidental associations or historical associations. It's just that that's what they probably are. But, I'm not outside of my culture. They mean something to me too.
No, that's really interesting. And when you were mentioning that, it kind of tied me into maybe a different way that I can kind of express it. And I think tying into what you're mentioning here is like when I did undergrad, I took some physics courses, right? And I went into these physics courses thinking that you're going to get an understanding, like a fundamental understanding of why. Whereas there's no why. It just is mathematical relationships that express, like it just expresses something, and you can repeat it, right? And you can see the mathematical relationship, and it just expresses what that is. It's kind of the same idea of someone like myself with no background in musical theory goes into a musical theory course thinking, okay, I'm going to understand this chord. It's like what it is and why. No, it's just like been repeated a bunch of times. It just fits, and that's what it is. And there's variations. No,
it's funny because it feels like, well, I mean, you may already have been on board before the conversation, but if you hadn't been, it sounds like you've been converted. Going back to the top, the whole point of why biosemioticians do what they do is because, if you're just doing kind of standard reductionist biology, it's not all that different from physics, right? You explain from the bottom up, and what looked to you like, real phenomena like, I don't know, mind and meaning and language and music are just will eventually explained as science marches forward, right? So as physics gets better and better, it's going to swallow up chemistry and biology and psychology and everything else. Or you can say that you can argue that that kind of reductionist perspective is always going to be incomplete because you're leaving out the symbolic part of life processes. So what you were saying about your physics course, that, what was incomplete about it, say, is like, it's a description, but it not only does it not include some of the phenomena, like some of like the wishy-washy ones up here at the top, but something fundamental to the phenomena down at the bottom. So it's a good explanation if you want to make technology. It's a good explanation for a lot of purposes. I mean, I wouldn't get rid of it, but it's always going to be incomplete.
Yeah. So that's okay. So then, that makes sense. So then that is the question that the research is looking at. What you're looking at is like, some people are arguing it is complete. Some would argue it's not complete. Like there is that underlying foundation at the top that is not yet addressed, and there's other kind of caveats to it.
And in particular for me, music, well, people will debate, but I'll just come out and say it. Music is at the leading edge of the history of symbolic behavior. That music is the most abstract, the most unconnected, or maybe disconnected from different reference and meaning, so that by looking at how music works, we can understand the entire progression as a whole.
That I don't. Okay, so, but man, that's so. It's fascinating. It's like, this is totally fascinating. But if you don't mind me just kind of digging in, and maybe for listeners as well, like, I know we've been speaking about it, but why do you make that like that distinction there? Like what is it then about music particularly that you feel that it's like the most disconnected? Is that a fair question?
Because music is about other music.
Oh yeah.
So like the lid has totally come off. Mm-hmm. Right. Certainly it's about, music has to do with the body and movement. In that sense, it's, physiological, and it has meaning in the way that, language and ritual and everything else that we do, that we kind of make up, that has meaning. But the fact that music that's to say language is of course about other language as well, but that music is so far in that direction. Oh. That it's like the most unhinged from the progression of symbolic behaviors that.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. That's so interesting. Now, then, if we frame ourselves here, right? We're 2019, and I guess the assumption then is it being unhinged. It's had this progression through evolution, right? And I know this is probably impossible to say, but like, where does this go? Like, do you then kind of assume that with the progression of language, right, becoming like we're evolving with the current language that we have today, we're evolving with the current music that we have today. What does that kind of mean in your perspective then for the future, I guess? Yeah, no,
that's a great question. The sort of quick answer is I have no idea.
Yeah.
but the longer answer is that, so all the ways that language and music and ritual and, et cetera, overlap, interact with each other, with our bodies and minds and institutions and all that, it's not going to be a satisfying answer, but that there is this rich symbolic ecosystem, and we're going to keep evolving with respect to that environment that we have a large hand in creating.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have this like exponential growth, and who knows where it's going to go.
Right. Oh, that's so cool. Okay. That's really, really cool, because we're moving forward. So it would be exponential growth, as with like language, technology, all these different things. Like the adaptations with music are going to change too, because as we progress, it's going to progress too.
Yes, exactly. And so because it's about us and our lives and all that, but it's also about itself. So in a way, there's no way to tell what music will be like, what it'll mean, what purposes it'll have for us. But except to say that the change is coming, ever more rapidly.
Right.
And, I don't know, hold on.
Oh, dude, I like it, man. And it makes me think of, one thing that's come up on this podcast quite often is this change in availability of music over like the last 10 years, right? So, 10 years ago, it was discs and there was record labels. There's still record labels, but record labels that had a lot of influence, and they would do distribution of actual hard disk, right? But now everything's on Spotify, so it's totally flipped the table. And now a lot of people are making music much more than previously, because you can make music on your computer for next to nothing, and you can distribute it for free. So there's like this influx in all this music. So I think Cohen, who had been on an episode quite some time ago, had this really good analogy where if you have every color in the rainbow, you have no color, right? Like if you bring everything in together, if you have so much different variation, you just get this blur of kind of one thing. Whereas like that kind of makes me think as to just our conversation here as to where this would go with this exponential change in how music progresses, how we progress, and access to technology and information to make the music, right? It's going to explode. There's going to be so much more content, but also I think those two things kind of in parallel, just so much content. And then this thing that you mentioned is going to make for a really weird future. And I don't know how to pinpoint it other than saying it's just going to be very, very strange.
For sure. I think when it comes to sort of like, when it comes to talking about the future, I think like sort of safest way to approach it is that, I mean, I agree with everything you said, but that the sort of, when you imagine there being so many different kinds of music and so many different communities and cultures and producers and, all working together, that it kind of becomes this like, it's like a white blur because of all the colors. I think that's already here and we already live in it. Right. That like, if there's something you think is coming, assuming humans have already done it, and then you'll be ahead of a lot of debates.
I like that.
But, you know, cause there's so many different kinds of music. And at least I don't know. And that it's, you know, it kind of fills, a space in terms of how I understand it. Like, I think I've heard world music from everywhere, but of course I haven't.
Right.
I have such a biased view, based on just, you know, a couple of samples, and not even just around the world. That, you know, that kind of diversity is right here at home. That you know, you have all these different people who make music in different ways, and it doesn't get distributed or whatever. So it's all there,
right.
And which just means we have a lot of listening to do. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you know, when these kind of conversations happen, for a second I almost get a little like I guess I don't want to say sad, but kind of like, oh man, if every genre is going to have happened, like what even is there? But then it's funny because just a few years ago, there will be these different types of like different genres that come into electronic music that you never, like I couldn't have imagined it. So like future bass, right? So I don't know if you're familiar with that style of music. A little, but it's fairly new. And before it, I wouldn't have been able to imagine that unique sound for that genre, but it's super distinct, you know? And so you put yourself here and you're like, well, okay, now we have future bass. There can't be, you know, and I'm not saying you're saying that, you know, but then we're going to just be walled by some different types of genre here around the corner that blow up. And that's for me, one reason why electronic music is so interesting. And a lot of different genres, but this is just the type of music I listen to mostly, but it's changing so quickly, and there will be things like that. There will just be game changers, and it's like, I didn't know where that came from. This is new. Even if I don't enjoy listening to that music, it's different, you know, and it's man, it really does make for an interesting place to have these conversations, an interesting place for people to be making music, and an interesting future for us to be moving into. I mean, it's
absolutely
really weird.
And I mean, different, like we were saying, different genres place a different amount of emphasis on novelty, right? That like you were saying about like top 40, that what you really want to do is like just encapsulate 2015.
Right.
And it's not necessarily new. It's just like, who knows what that even means. But, yeah, I mean, at least for me personally, I think the genres that are looking to break out are the most fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, of course we could talk to someone who likes tradition or, you know, people in classical music like mastery and virtuosity. And that requires, you know, looking back a little, and that's great. But yeah, for my personal taste, I like novelty.
Yeah, same. No, it's really, really fascinating. This conversation has been so cool because when I was reading your research, I was reading through everything. I was taking notes. I was trying to get a good understanding of exactly what you're doing, but I didn't fully understand it until having this conversation. And it's these real subtleties that you kind of are picking at, that if someone were to not put in the time to think about these kind of things, you wouldn't come across these ideas easily. Like just the subtleties of the research you're specifically looking at, right? And how we've addressed it today, I think is just so fascinating. And man, it's always so cool to be able to do these. I really, really appreciate it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. No, you're, this is great. I didn't know the podcast before you got in touch, but you know, like I told you, I've since listened to a bunch, and
cool. Yeah.
I plan to keep keep it up.
Yeah, no, well, and I would be more than happy, to do these in the future. If say you want to do this in, down the road 6 months, a year, reconvene, talk about research, talk about, things that have changed, because I'm sure that will definitely happen. There will be lots of changes, I would love to do so.
That sounds great.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you again. And that is it for today's episode. Thank you again to Matthew Slayton. Dang, that was a doozy. I just feel like his research was so fascinating, and I hope, from my perspective, I hope that I was a good host and I asked some intelligent questions, because, man, I just thought this research was so deep, and he, again, is such a brilliant guy that it made for me a fascinating conversation to have. Also, if you'd like to learn more, as I mentioned earlier, Twitter @SlaytonComposer. That's the best way to keep in touch with him and all of the fascinating research that he is doing. Also, thank you to Cube for sharing out his song at the beginning of today's episode. Absolutely awesome. And again, if you would like your music shown out at the beginning of an episode, just reach out to me. So that is it for episode 25. Man, what an awesome episode. Looking forward to releasing the future ones, and I hope to speak with you all again soon.